What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Normal Christians Podcast. My name is Bo. As always, I reserve the right to get smarter. And in this episode, I want to talk about a subject that I love because I think it's so important. And I want to highlight one aspect of this topic, and that's pretty relevant right now. And that topic overall is one of adoption. I truly think that adoption is, it's such a cool and important subject, a cool and important practice whenever I get to see it happen and come into play. But the reason I say I want to bring out an aspect of it that's pretty relevant right now is because you might be surprised to know that one named Simone Biles was actually adopted. A little bit of a different adoption, but still adopted. And that's because I say it's relevant because the Olympics are going on and Simone Biles has been in the news. So I want to highlight some aspects of Simone Biles' story. And then I want to highlight actually another Olympic athlete that made the news for being adopted. And then I want to kind of get into some stuff that I think about adoption, why it's so cool, and why I think as Christians this should be something in a lot of ways we all consider or we all think about. So let's talk about Simone Biles. And I'm pulling all this from it was People magazine. It was their online, their website. There's an article on there. So you could find that on there with Simone Biles. But anyway, the article says, in the episode aptly titled, Who Am I?, Biles recalled how her birth mother couldn't care for her or her 3 siblings. I don't remember a lot about foster care, but I definitely knew that we had been taken from our biological mom, and then you just think you're going to go back to her, she said, that being Simone Biles. We were very fortunate that we actually got to stay with our siblings because a lot of the time you either get regrouped from home to home, or you and your siblings get split up, the star continued. According to Biles' grandmother, Nellie, I believe, her birth mother was, this is a quote, doing a lot of drinking and drugs at the time, which prompted social workers to take action and remove Biles and her siblings after neighbors had expressed concerns. During the candid episode, Biles also recalled a time when she and her siblings were focused on finding food. Growing up, me and my siblings were so focused on food because we didn't have a lot of food, Biles said. I remember there was a cat around the house, and I'd be so hungry. They would feed this cat, and I'm like, where the heck is my food? When Biles was 6 years old, she and her younger sister, Adria, were adopted by grandparents Nellie and Ron, while older siblings, Ashley and Tevin, were adopted by an aunt in Ohio. Biles said being removed from her biological mother and later adopted by her grandparents gave her a second shot, to quote her, in life, adding, being separated from my biological mom, being placed in foster care before I officially got adopted by my grandparents, it just set me up for a better route in life, the athlete continued. And I feel like I wouldn't be where I am unless that turning point happened. I would still be Simone Biles, probably not the Simone Biles that everyone else knows, the world knows. But I also believe everything happens for a reason. And I'm forever grateful for that because I definitely got a second shot in life. So what a cool story from Simone Biles recording a little bit about her childhood and how she got to where she was and certainly some difficulties she faced. I mean, being that hungry for food where you're envious of a stray cat that's getting food. But to go to a different story from some random website that I'm not sure of, but they had the story of this girl named Maggie McNeil, and I'll read from that now. An adopted Chinese girl captured Canada's first gold medal at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, and it sparked outcry in China's domestic media over its now scrapped one-child policy. On Monday, Canada's Maggie McNeil, who was born in China, garnered worldwide fame as she was crowned Olympic champion ahead of China's Zhang Yufei. I butchered that name, I'm sure. The top-ranked swimmer in the world's 100-meter butterfly. McNeil, as mainland media reported, was abandoned by her biological parents after being born in a certain province that I'm not going to try to pronounce in February 2000. 1 year later, she was adopted as a toddler along with her younger sister from a local orphanage by Susan McNair and Edward McNeil of London, Ontario, Canada. And they brought both children back to their hometown. The 21-year-old world champion story is one of thousands, if not millions, of deserted children in China under the now scrapped one-child policy. And here's a quote. Imagine had she not been brought up from the orphanage, or had she not been deserted by her biological parents. What would she be now? Wrote one comment on the country's microbiology site Weibo, microblogging site, whatever that is. The adoption changed her life orbit completely, and she was given such quality care and training. She might have dropped out of school to support her younger brother had she stayed in China, wrote another person. McNeil's story also reminds many of U.S. gymnast Morgan Hurd's own journey. Born in China's, another different province, in 2001, Hurd was adopted by her mother, Sherry Hurd, of Middleton, Delaware, at 11 years old, and started gymnastics at the age of 3. The bespectacled U.S. elite gymnast snatched a surprise women's all-around gold at her World Championships debut in 2017. She claimed the World Championship silver on the floor and the all-around bronze the following year. According to the U.S. Department of State, among 82,456 children that were Americans adopted from China. Let me try not to butcher that. According to the U.S. Department of State, among the 82,456 children that Americans adopted from China between 1999 and 2020, 82.14% were females. And there's a quote. How many girls failed to realize their potential because of the preference for a boy? One question. How many female talents have we missed out on? And so that article obviously had more of a skew towards China's one-child policy. But I found it and I thought it was really cool that here's another Olympic champion, an Olympic gold medalist in this current Olympics. And she is where she is because of adoption. Who knows where she would have been without that? It also highlighted very quickly an American gymnast who was also adopted. And she's doing great things. So again, who knows where she would be? And as that last quote kind of said, how many real talents are missed out on? Because basically kids don't get a chance. Or to quote Simone Augustus, she said, but I believe everything happens for a reason. And I'm forever grateful for that because I definitely got a second shot at life. And I love that part. I love that sentiment. It's why I love adoption. It does give kids a second chance at life a lot of times. More opportunities, different opportunities than they may have ever had otherwise. And look, I would certainly be foolish to think that all adoption stories end like these, right? That people just go adopt, and there's this big happily ever after storybook sort of ending. But I just know that's not the case. I know personally of some stories where there is struggle with adoption, not only through the adoption process, which is extremely difficult and expensive at times, but also once people get the kids home, and there's just struggles. Sometimes these kids have been through tremendously difficult things, and the trauma that they have resurfaces in a lot of ways and in a lot of different parts of life. And so these adopted parents, they're having to deal with those aspects. So some are really bad and rough. There are so many incredible stories, though, despite the bad ones, despite the realistic knowledge that with adoption, things can go great, but they can go wrong. And wrong's not the right word. It can be extremely difficult and rough. But for all those rough ones, man, there's also so many good ones. And that's not to dismiss the rough ones, because those parents are still doing something awesome by giving these kids a shot, trying to care for them and do that sort of thing. So I'm not just glossing over that, and I don't want that to be taken that way. But there's so many incredible stories of what kids were able to achieve or go on to do simply because why they were given a second shot at life. They were given another, maybe incredible opportunity that they would not have had otherwise, except through adoption. And to me, adoption should be something on every Christian's mind. And here's what I mean by that. First, really, adoption is a key part of our theology, right? If you're a Christian, I hope you know that. Galatians 4:4-6 says this, Paul, here he says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. What a beautiful thing. If you are a Christian, there's a lot that happens when you become a Christian. You're justified. You're redeemed. Your sin is atoned for, all these different things. But you're also adopted into the family of God as a son of God. Now, this is not the point of this podcast, but I do want to take a second to address a little bit of the whole being adopted as a son of God, because a lot of Bible and translations now are adding sons and daughters of God. But that misses the point of what Paul is saying here. Because in that day, daughters did not get an inheritance. Sons were the ones who got inheritance. And so what's happening here, whenever Paul says you're adopted as a son into God's family, he's not being sexist. What he's saying incredibly is that we're given an incredible status, an unbelievable status, that despite us not being able to earn it, and certainly not deserving it, God brings us into His family and gives us the position of a son in the family, which in that day means that we get an inheritance. And there's a lot dealing theologically with the inheritance that we have theologically. So I just want to say, when you hear, in churches or you read your Bible and it says, well, we're adopted sons and daughters of God, that's not really the thrust of what's happening here. And it actually takes away from the beautiful message that Paul's trying to get across and that the Bible's trying to communicate in a lot of ways, is that regardless of who you are, whether you are male or female, whether you are a slave or you are free, a Gentile or a Jew, or whatever your status, all of that goes away and you instantly get a different status in so many aspects. And one of that is that you are adopted as a son into the family of God. You now get an incredible eternal inheritance that's waiting for you. Whoa, okay, come on. We preaching in the house today, wherever you're at, in the car, listening. We getting a little sermon-y here. But it really does bother me, I think. I get some of the modern translations are trying to soften up some different things, but it misses the point that we gain a status and an adoption, not only with God in the theological aspect, but adoption in our day and age. And what happens, it's the same sort of thing. If you want to think about last name, in a sense, all of a sudden this kid went from being associated with different people, different family, and in a moment, once that adoption goes through, now that kid is a part of a new family, and a lot of times a better family. And all of a sudden, this kid gets all of the benefits, all of the privileges that come with being in that family, including, a lot of times, depending on the situation, an inheritance. If we're just trying to connect the dots, not all the time, but you get my point. For Christians, adoption is a key part of our theology. And I think that should always be in our minds in general, especially with what we get from God and Christ and through Christ's sacrifice and His resurrection. But also as Christians, I believe we should all think of adoption as an option for us, as something that we should potentially do. And I know that may sound like a lot, and that may sound like something maybe even rather crazy to some people. But I do think there's something powerful and important about it. Now, when I say this, I don't mean that everyone should adopt. That's clearly painting with too broad of a brushstroke. Some people will not be called to adopt. Some people have large families as it is. But I do think that Christians should think more and more and more about adoption, and for a couple of reasons right here. I think first, orphans hold a special place in God's heart. I mean, you can just go through your Bible. There are multiple times talking about God's justice for the orphan, the widow, and depending on where you look, the sojourner at time. But orphans and widows definitely pop up a lot, and specifically orphans, because why? Christ had a soft spot for those who were powerless, who were marginalized within society, people who were not able to defend themselves. And so Christ, in a lot of ways, wants His people to defend the powerless, to be the voice of the voiceless, those sort of things, to help push people away from being marginalized and into a community and into that sort of aspect. And that's also why Christ goes very hard in some ways at the religious people of His day that come against them. And now I'm not going to start preaching another sermon here, but orphans they have a special place in God's heart. They are powerless in so many ways. And if not for people stepping in What is the future of these kids, of these people? And this brings me to the second thing. Just in general, think about how crazy having kids, how crazy it really is. Just from the aspect of, if you are a Christian, right, we believe that every person is created in the image of God. We also believe that every person has a soul that will live on for all of eternity. I know there's some debate about that. Some people are annihilationists, and I'm not going to go down that road. But just in general, most Christians, I believe, feel that we have souls. If we're Christian, we'll eventually get a new body again and live on earth, blah, blah, blah. But this aspect that each and every person, every single person who was ever born is created in the image of God, therefore has infinite value, and they have a soul that will live forever. They will live and exist forever. Well, think about how crazy having a kid is. It's just like somehow, in God's wisdom and how he operates things, we as humans get to take a part in the process of creating an eternal person and an eternal being. Now, certainly I know God is the one who creates them, but I'm not going to do it on this podcast. I don't have to hopefully explain the process of baby making on this process. We're not doing that. But somehow, some way, in our physical process of creating a human being, it pairs up with God's overall process, right, of how he creates the soul. And we get this body, and this person lives forever. They are an eternal being made in the very image of our God. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but it's absolutely nuts to think we get to play some part in God's overall creating of a new eternal being. And I know someone may be listening to screaming about some theological nuance that I'm not adding, and I get it. This is just a basic podcast talking in general. But that overall thought is it's just nuts to me. It really makes you think twice about having kids, right? No, I'm just kidding. Proverbs talks all the time about kids or jewels and the crown of the parents and all kinds of stuff like that. So I'm not going down that route. But it is crazy that we get to take a part in the process of this person that we create was created by God to live forever. But unfortunately, some people don't think much about having kids for many different reasons that I'm not going to get into. But unfortunately, sometimes these people who don't particularly care or think through having kids, unfortunately, the kid is the one who suffers. And almost all the time, it's the kid. The kid is the one who suffers, right? So many times I've seen these terrible, terrible domestic situations, and it's the kids suffering over and over and over and over again. As I've mentioned before, my dad is a judge, and I've seen this a lot with that. He was also a lawyer before, saw a lot with that. And then I don't even have time to talk about my time in detention. I was in juvie, and so many of these kids had rough or terrible situations that they came from. And really, hear me, sometimes for these kids, the greatest crime they committed was that kid was just born to the wrong parents. They just, if you want to think of it a different way, lost the lottery of life. And that might be a crazy thing when I'm talking about detention, because we had some kids in there for murder, and we had some very big charges. Not all of them were that way, but there certainly were some. But still, you would look at these kids, and you look at some of their situations, and you would think, man, even though you're in here for something terrible, really the greatest crime that's happened, that all you did was that you just happened to be born to the wrong parent in the wrong situation. So I think it's crazy, and I think it's beautiful that we as Christians get the opportunity to act out a theological principle that is in play in all of our lives if we are a Christian. And we get the opportunity to maybe change someone's destiny along the way, maybe forever. And if that isn't attractive to a Christian, I don't know what is. Again, that we as Christians, we are adopted. This is a theological principle. And now we get to actually put skin, and we get to put flesh, and we get to put reality to this theological principle in our lives and in the life of someone who is powerless, who maybe, again, the only thing that they did wrong was they were just born to the wrong people at the wrong time. How can that not be attractive to us as Christians. Sure, adoption is expensive. Sure, it can go wrong in so many ways. But still, I think it's worth the burden and the difficulty if we feel like we're called to do that. And let me preface this: feel called to do that. Sometimes we default to that too quickly as Christians. Like, well, I'll pray and I'll see if I'm called to it. Well, sometimes you don't have to see if you're called to something if it's clear in Scripture, right? Like, I don't have to feel called to not murder someone. I don't have to feel that call. That's clear. So adoption isn't a clear-cut thing. I do think we need to pray and seek God. But I think too often Christians, we dismiss it, or it doesn't fit neatly into our plans that we have. And I think we should take a step back, look at the theological principle, look at these poor kids, and think, man, I can maybe change an entire destiny by this action. Yeah, maybe the kid will be a burden. Maybe it will be difficult and expensive. But by the way, then again, natural kids that could be the same sort of thing. You never know what's going to happen. But you can look at this kid and think, man, I can change something in them. I can give this kid a second chance, like we talked about with Simone Biles. And by the way, don't adopt people to try to get Simone Biles or to get on the Blind Side, the movie, that NFL lineman. Don't adopt for an athlete. I'm kind of laughing, but kind of serious, because I've actually heard people talk about that way. But putting that theological principle into play, how is that not beautiful and attractive to us? So I think more Christians should think about it. And honestly, I'm single, unfortunately. I shouldn't say unfortunately, but really there's not any real prospects for any sort of natural kids or anything right now. And as I get older, this is the unfortunate part, your boy's not getting any younger. But for years, and I mean, for a long time now, I've always wanted to adopt. And as I get older, it really becomes more and more of a reality where I go, you know what? I do think adoption's something that I want to do. I've always felt that way, but even more now as I get older. Because to be honest, your boy doesn't want to go through the poopy diaper stage. I'm just saying. Okay. I'm joking. Someone's listening to this going, oh, Bo is such a terrible person. Okay, kind of am. But no, that's my confession. Obviously, there's two people in a marriage, so another party would have quite a say in that. Maybe more of a say than me. But I do want to adopt for myself personally. And I encourage you, man. Maybe you're too far past that point and you go, well, we're past kids. That's fine. Maybe think of fostering, or maybe not at all. Maybe just pray. Or here's a big thing. Maybe help out someone who's thinking about adopting. Maybe help them financially. Take some of that burden off if you're not going to adopt. But certainly I would encourage people, especially if you're younger, maybe a younger family, think about adoption. It's beautiful. It truly will make a difference in someone's life. And whether the result comes out like you think it, or like you wanted to or not, man, you still did something for an eternal soul, for someone that will live forever. And whether that kid ever reciprocates it or ever turns out how you think it should, or maybe it turns out to a disaster, I don't know, whatever it is, I truly believe God will honor us. Maybe not bless us in this life like many of the prosperity people, but he will honor us in many different ways. And I believe we would get that reward in eternity for stepping out in faith and saying, you know what, God, I'm going to do what it takes to change a life, to maybe save a soul and change a destiny, whatever it is. So anyway, all that to say, I'm rambling at the end there. Adoption's awesome. We should all think about it. And I think it should get us excited at times. So I know in the future I'm looking forward to it. Maybe this will help you think more about it. Or maybe, like I said, you don't want to do that, but maybe you would help relieve the burden of someone's financial load with that, or whatever it is. Or maybe just pray that other kids would get adopted. Who knows? Whatever it is, thank you for taking the time to listen to my rant about adoption. I just thought it was super cool as we go through the Olympics to see these Olympic athletes get a shot, really in a lot of ways because they were adopted. So again, thank you for listening, however you're listening. And as I go, 3515, I'll see you next time.